What's up, Buck? Doug with D&E in the Garage. Today I want to talk about something that I originally brought up in the Golden Age of Jeeps video. If you haven't seen that one, go check it out. It's alternate history. It's what would have happened if the Chrysler Corporation had not purchased the Jeep brand in 1987. For those that don't know, in the 80s, Jeep is owned by the AMC, the American Motor Corporation. They are going under. The Jeep brand is up for sale. Lee Iacocca, the head of Chrysler Corporation at the time, decides he wants to purchase the Jeep brand, make it a Chrysler product, and the rest of it is history. One of the things that made Jeep so successful under Chrysler is the fact that they went hands-off. They let Jeep build an identity, and that's why we have the brand as it exists today. It's a huge brand today. It's the best, I believe it's the best-selling brand under the Fiat Chrysler umbrella. So what I want to talk about today, though, is what happens if the Chrysler Corporation did not purchase the Jeep brand. All right, and to do that, I've come up with some criteria to look at different scenarios. We're going to look at what would have happened to the 4 vehicles that were actively being sold at that time. That's going to be your Wrangler, your Wagoneer, your Cherokee, and your Comanche. We're going to look at what would have happened to the Grand Cherokee, because the Grand Cherokee was all designed. It was almost ready to go to market. In fact, it's one of the reasons that Chrysler wanted to purchase the Jeep brand. They saw the plans for the ZJ. They had just had great success with the 85 Dodge Caravan, and they knew that families were going away from sedans and wagons and they were going towards minivans and SUVs. So they wanted the Grand Cherokee. So we're going to look at what would have happened to those 5 vehicles. Then we're going to look at what would have happened to the 4-liter, because what's more iconic than the 4-liter to Jeeps in the 90s? And we're going to look at solid front axles. I think this is a very big point because it's very odd when you look at the rest of the automotive industry that Chrysler let Jeep keep putting solid front axles on unibody, relatively small SUVs for as long as they did. The WJ had it until 2004. That's pretty significant, you know. Today, you have to get a heavy-duty pickup truck or a Wrangler to get a solid front axle. Finally, we're going to look at where the brand would have gone after the year 2000. All right, now, originally this was all going to be one video, but I found way too much information to make it one video. I don't want to keep y'all sitting here for an hour. Nobody wants to hear me talk for that long. So what we're going to do is break it into 2 pieces. Today, we're going to talk about what would have happened if one of the other big 3 companies had purchased the Jeep brand. So Chrysler did buy it. What would have happened if Ford or GM purchased the Jeep brand? Let's get right into this. What would have happened if GM purchased Jeep instead of Chrysler, right? Let's look at the Wrangler. The Wrangler absolutely would have existed. It was already in production as the YJ when the company was sold. I believe GM keeps the YJ longer. They don't refresh it in 96. Maybe they give it a facelift somewhere along the line. They let it stay on its own platform until 1999-2000. What happens in GM in 1999-2000? They purchase Hummer, all right? This is significant because, first of all, originally the Hummer is designed by the same guys that designed Jeeps, all right? AMC owned Jeeps. They were designing Jeeps. AM General designed the first Hummer. AM General is just the government contract wing of AMC. That's why the Hummer has a 7-slat grille, because it was originally designed, it's in the same family with the Jeep. In fact, once GM purchased Hummer and started selling it, Chrysler tried to sue them over the 7-slat grille, and the courts found in favor of GM. They said, listen, man, you know, the Hummer rightfully had the 7-slat grille because it was designed by the same people as that were designing Jeeps, and so when GM purchased Hummer, they purchased the rights to that 7-slat grille. This is significant because when GM purchases Hummer, they put it on their GMT 355 platform. For reference, that's the same platform that the Colorado went on when it came out. It's a light truck platform, and I believe that in early 2000s, the Wrangler would have also been merged into this platform. Let me explain why. The GM model that I've been exploring is what I'm going to call a full integration model. All right, GM doesn't just buy brands and leave them alone. They are so good. I mean, every company does this, but they're so good at taking a platform, building 7 different vehicles on it and selling it under 5 different companies or whatever. They make a Suburban, they sell it to the common man as a Chevy. Then they make a Yukon, they sell it as to the boss, as a GMC, and then they make an Escalade and they sell it as a luxury vehicle under Cadillac. It's the same vehicle. It's the same vehicle. They just change the amenities, and in that way they are able to touch every market segment. They do it with all their vehicles, and all companies do this, but GM, in my opinion, is the best at it. All right, they will make the exact same vehicle and sell it under 5 different brands, and it's the same vehicle, you know, but they're able to touch every market segment. So to keep that going, when they purchase Jeep, they need to fold it into their brands. So this is what I'm going to call, like I said, a full integration model. So the Wrangler does get merged into other platforms. It gets merged with the GMT 355, and then from then on, the Wrangler and the Hummer kind of progress together. Maybe the Wrangler is kind of like a 2-door version of the Hummer. Something interesting would be when they make that HT3, which is the Hummer pickup. We probably get a Wrangler pickup in that scenario, but the Wrangler is not allowed to stay on its own platform the way it does in the Chrysler line. Today, there's never been a vehicle that shared a platform with a Wrangler. Wrangler is just a Wrangler, and that's all it is. Additionally, it's important to note that the GMT 355 platform has independent front suspension, so after the YJ, the Wrangler loses its solid front axle. All right, after that, we look at the Grand Cherokee. The Grand Cherokee is allowed to come to market as is. I can't decide whether or not it debuts with a solid front axle, but it doesn't really matter. It debuts in 93, however it is, it gets a facelift sometime around 97, 98. In 2002, it is merged with the GMT 360 platform. For reference, that platform is the Trailblazer. What GM ends up doing is they make Jeep to GM, kind of what Scion is to Toyota. Let me explain. You know, they've got Chevy is the everyman car, and then you've got Buick, and GMC is just like the upscale, the leather seat version of those two. And then you've got the luxury brand Cadillac. Well, Jeep, they slide in, I'm going to say under Chevy, as the fun, youthful version of all those other vehicles. So if they're going to make an off-road version of something, you know, it's the same vehicle as up here, but they label it a Jeep. That's what Toyota did with Scion. They wanted to make cars that could appeal to a different segment of the market, but they didn't want to pollute their own pool. They didn't want to change their own image to do that. So I think that's how GM uses the Jeep brand. And this comes out in the Grand Cherokee. They make the Trailblazer, and then, you know, they call it a Grand Cherokee on the Jeep line. And it's probably the more rugged off-roady version, maybe a little more youthful, maybe it has a better sound system, I don't know. But they market it more towards younger people and a little bit more outdoorsy people. It's not marketed quite so much as a grocery getter. Let's talk about the Cherokee. The Cherokee's kind of a sad story on this timeline because it's just not needed in the lineup anywhere. All right, GM has the Tracker, which is a small 2-door. I think the Tracker's full frame or some kind of weird subframe. It's actually a pretty robust vehicle, but they have the Tracker, which is a small, today we call crossover, and then they have the Blazer, which in the 90s is a full frame SUV based on the S10 truck platform. They don't need this Cherokee, the XJ, in between there. So they probably don't promote it as much. It's probably allowed to die a natural death. Maybe 95, maybe it makes it to 2000, 2001. In 2001, they bring out the 2nd gen Tracker, and I believe that at that point, they would carry this nameplate, the Cherokee nameplate, onto the 2nd gen Tracker. So you still have the Chevy Tracker, but then under the Jeep name, you have the Cherokee, which is just a Tracker rebadged. Now, of that Tracker, they made a ZR2 version, which is the off-road version. I think it had 2 inches of lift. It came with gnarlier tires, tow hooks, you know, everything you'd expect on an off-road package. Instead of making that ZR2 version, the Cherokee gets it. Cherokee, which is really just a Tracker. And then from then on, it progresses with the Tracker name. You know, as the Tracker progresses down the line, so does the Cherokee. After that, you look at the Comanche. The Comanche is kind of in the same zone as the Cherokee. It's not really needed. There's an interesting thing about the Comanche. It's a very unique truck. The body is unibody. There's no frame underneath the cab of a Comanche. That's unibody, just like the Cherokee is. Then there's a subframe that holds the bed on. It makes it an incredibly handling, it makes it a truck that handles incredibly well, but it reduces some of the towing and payload capacity. So maybe it sticks around till 93 in its own form, and then it gets merged into the S10 platform. So you get an S10, looks like an S10, is an S10, full frame, all that. It's got a Jeep grille and it's called the Comanche. And again, instead of making a ZR2 version of the S10, you get the Comanche, which is an S10, but it's a little lifted and it's made for off-road use. And maybe they only make it sporadically. Maybe it doesn't get made every model year, but it progresses with the S10. It's hard to say if when the S10 goes away in favor of the bigger Colorado, if the Comanche would follow along and be merged up onto that GMT 355 platform. I suspect no. The Comanche probably doesn't live past 2000 on this timeline. Wagoneer, same thing. It's not needed. It's a relic at this point. A full frame station wagon. GM has the B-body platform, which is going to be your Caprice, your Roadmaster wagon. They don't need the Comanche, and that platform isn't long for this world anyway, so I don't think they bother with the Wagoneer. It maybe lasts till 92 or 93 like it did in our timeline. The 4-liter obviously does not really need to exist. Chevy has an entire stable of engines. I think the workhorse for the Jeep brand would end up being the 4.3 V6. The interesting thing about that, let me tell you a little side story and then we'll loop around. In 1991, GM took a GMC Sonoma, which is basically an S10. They put a body kit on it and they slapped a Mitsubishi turbo on the 4.3 liter. They called it the Cyclone. There was a rear-wheel drive drag truck. That's all it was, and it was fast as hell. It was killing Camaros. I mean, the quarter-mile time on that truck was insane. They sold it for 2 years, 91, 92. Then in 93, they took a GMC Jimmy, which is just a Chevy Blazer. It's all on the same platform. Put the same body kit on it, slapped the same turbo on the 4.3, called it the Cyclone. Typhoon, sorry. The truck was the Cyclone, the SUV was the Typhoon. They sold it for 1 year, the 93 model year. And again, this thing is insane. It's one of the coolest SUVs of all time. 2-door, 2-wheel drive, turbo 6. It's basically a Grand National truck. And why GM didn't capitalize on the Grand National name and call them Grand National trucks, I will never know. But they obviously should have. I think the Grand Cherokee absolutely gets a version of this. Picture this. Grand Cherokee comes out in 93, hugely successful. Sometime around 94 or 95, they make, I can't even begin to guess what they would have called it, but they put that same Turbo 6 in the Grand Cherokee. That would be cool. That is one of the highlights, in my opinion, of this timeline. All right. Looking at the company after the year 2000, by 2002, all of the original Jeep platforms are merged into GM platforms. Your Wrangler is on par with your Colorado and your Hummer. Your Grand Cherokee is running alongside the Trailblazer. Your Comanche's probably gone. Your Cherokee is probably running alongside the Tracker. Your Wagoneer is gone. I can't even pretend that I actually believe this would happen, but how cool would it be if they gave us a suburban version of the Wagoneer? So basically make the Suburban, make it an off-road package, and slap the Wagoneer badge on it. That would be cool, and realistically, there'd be no need for that. If you look at the early 2000s, SUVs are SUV is a dirty word, right? What was the buzzword for all of from 2000 to 2010? Gas guzzler. Gas guzzlers. You can't afford to buy them. You can't afford to put gas in them, and they're killing the environment anyway. All right. There was a lot of hate, a lot of shade being thrown at SUVs. So it's tricky to determine how well the Jeep brand would have done in different conditions, and that leads me to the unfortunate bit about this timeline. All right. If you know anything about GM, you know in 2009 they were doing terribly. They filed for bankruptcy. They had to go to Big Brother and ask for some corporate welfare, which they were given, and they had to kill off half of their brands. All right. Before the bankruptcy, GM, the GM umbrella includes Chevy, Buick, GMC, Cadillac, Saab, Hummer, Pontiac, and Saturn. All right, they have to kill off Pontiac, which breaks my heart. They have to kill off Saturn, which is also sad. Saturns were cool. They have to kill off Hummer, which I don't find particularly sad, and they had to sell Saab. Saab does still exist somewhere. It didn't get killed. I just don't know what they do. Think about it. SUVs are not selling well. GM is desperately trying to save their company, killing off storied brands like Pontiac, all right? In this timeline, Jeep gets killed off in this same round of beheadings. It's a company that only sells SUVs, and I don't think it would be sustainable in the eyes of GM. So in this timeline, we lose the Jeep brand in 2009. Sad, very sad. It could be argued that of all the potentialities we're going to talk about, this is in fact the darkest timeline. Let's move on to a less dark timeline. Ford. What would it look like if Chrysler had not bought Jeep and Ford had purchased the Jeep brand? All right, we're going to switch gears here a little bit. First and foremost, let's talk about the Wrangler. The Wrangler gets V8 options, for sure. In the 90s, Jeep was strapping that 5-liter to whatever they could get their hands on. You get a 5-liter Wrangler. It's not far-fetched because the predecessor to the Wrangler, the CJ, always had V8 options. So it was always strange to me that Chrysler never tried to shove a 5.2 into a Wrangler. I don't know if maybe it wouldn't fit. I don't know. I guess there's not a ton of room in a YJ engine compartment. In this timeline, for sure, Ford finds a way to sneak that 5-liter in or some other V8. The YJ exists exactly as it was. Wranglers follow the same milestones. You get the YJ until 95, 96 you get the TJ, 06 you get the JK, or 07. When did the JK come out? Doesn't matter. Here's the difference. YJ exists exactly as it is. Dana axles, probably the 4-liter, just they didn't even want to bother changing it, which would have been smart. All right, it should be mentioned here that Ford is a partial integration model. All right, Ford is going to do some of the same things that Chevy did, meaning merge it into other brands, but they're going to allow Jeep to keep their identity more than GM would have. All right, and a good example of this is the Wrangler. The Wrangler does not ever get merged. It stays on its own platform. So the YJ exists exactly as it is. The TJ becomes the first vehicle that Ford designs for the Jeep brand. Everything else existed before they started. It looks much like the TJ we got. What are some notable differences? Well, you get an 8.8 standard. That's pretty friggin' awesome. Like I discussed, V8 options. The 4-liter most likely goes away. We'll talk about that more in a minute when we get to the 4-liter. Here's something interesting. Twin beam front suspension. I believe that Ford would have put the twin beam front suspension in it in favor of the Dana 30 or whatever else you could have got. This is really interesting. I know of people who have put Ford twin beam suspensions into Jeeps. I also know a lot of Ford guys that hate the twin beam suspension, so for better or worse, that would have happened. The real shakeup comes at the JK. So the YJ gets a solid front axle, the TJ gets the twin beam, which is like pseudo independent front suspension, and then the JK gets full independent front suspension. Ford is a very forward-thinking company for an American company. They really are, and it's probably the reason that they never needed a bailout. GM needed to be bailed out. My beloved Chrysler needed to be bailed out. Ford did not, all right, because they are smart enough to notice where the market's going and they don't drag their feet the way GM and Chrysler did. So the Wrangler gets independent front suspension on this timeline, but again, it does not ever merge with any Ford platform. Grand Cherokee. Grand Cherokee comes out as designed. Probably gets a facelift around 98, 97, because Ford knows full well that in 2000, 2001, in that range, they're going to merge it with a Ford platform. And one of two things happens. Either it goes down in size, it goes down to the Ford CFC platform, which is actually the Mazda GF platform, and it merges with the Escape. Ford Escape is on the Ford CDC platform, which is the exact same thing as the Mazda GF platform, Mazda Tribute. So think that size. The Grand Cherokee either goes down to meet those vehicles, or it goes up in size and it merges with the Ford U1 platform to become an Explorer. Think how big the Explorer was. This is the 3rd-gen Explorer. That's going to be 2001, I believe. Think how big Explorers were in 2001. It kind of sounds outlandish. Cool thing there is that's a solid, a full-frame vehicle. So a full-frame Grand Cherokee, you're definitely getting 5 liters, maybe even 351s there. That would be a beastly Grand Cherokee, all right? And then whichever direction it goes, it stays with that timeline. It either stays small and progresses alongside, in the compact range with the Escape, or it stays bigger in the full SUV size with the Explorer. The interesting thing is if you look at a modern, like a 2018 Explorer next to a 2018 Jeep Grand Cherokee, they're very similar. Almost identical in size, they look similar, they're very clearly competitors, so it's super easy to see that that is the road the Grand Cherokee takes. If the Grand Cherokee goes larger and progresses with the Explorer, that leaves room for the Cherokee to get on the CDC platform, and that is most likely what would have happened. The Grand Cherokee goes up in size, the Cherokee becomes a little smaller than it is, not much smaller. This is a pretty small SUV, and it progresses on the CDC platform with the Escape. Unfortunately, if it does not, if the Grand Cherokee goes down in size, the Cherokee's killed, because then you don't need two tiny SUVs on that same, you know, under the same Ford umbrella. We lose the Comanche almost immediately. I don't think Ford would have any interest in selling it. I don't think they'd have any interest in rebranding the Ranger as a Comanche. Wagoneer, same thing. They have the Panther body, they have the Taurus wagon, they don't need this big full frame goofy thing. And as we previously discussed, wagons were on their way out anyway. The 4-liter I mentioned is gone. We get more V8 options, and obviously later on we get EcoBoost options. The worst part about this timeline is knowing full well that Jeeps are going to be driving around with the Vulcan V6. I hate the Vulcan V6. It's one of the worst motors ever conceived, and they used it for like 30 friggin' years. It's just a heavy pushrod V6 with no power, low revving, all kinds of noise. It's hard to work on. It's got stupid problems. It's a terrible motor, and honestly, as bad as the GM timeline is, knowing that Cherokees are going to be driving around, possibly even XJ Cherokees driving around with like the Vulcan V6 or one of the similars, the Duratec isn't as bad. Makes me, I hate it. The 4-liter goes away. The Ford doesn't need the 4-liter. They've got, again, a whole stable of their own engines. Solid front axles go away completely in all vehicles that were not originally designed by AMC. So as soon as the XJ's gone, the Cherokee doesn't have it. As soon as the ZJ's gone, the Grand Cherokee doesn't have it. As soon as the Wrangler keeps it until the JK, depending on what you classify twin beam as. It's independent front suspension. Let's look at the company after the 2000s. There's something interesting here. If you're familiar with the Ford Edge, I don't think there's any question that we get a version of the Ford Edge called the Wagoneer. That's kind of cool, right? So we lose the Wagoneer for, what is that, like 15 some odd years, and then around 2010 when they released the Edge, we get our own Wagoneer. That's pretty cool. The company definitely survives because Ford did a good job of changing with the times. That's really all there is to it. As much as I love Chrysler, they are really good at just staying stubborn, and Ford is not. So Ford doesn't need a bailout. They are able to keep selling SUVs. We get EcoBoost. The brands, the nameplates that I described continue living on to today. Maybe at some point we get an F-150. They probably call it the Gladiator. That would be awesome. And I say this, it's reasonable to assume. Remember, they did like the Lincoln pickup truck. It's just an F-150 that they called a Lincoln, but they sold it for a couple years. You know, I don't know how well it sold, but I think without a doubt they would have made an off-road version of the F-150 and called it a Gladiator, you know, which is, you know, an old Jeep pickup truck name. Another interesting thing to think about, the Raptor, right? If you have a brand under your umbrella that's known full well for being an off-road brand, and you have a production trophy truck, do you not merge those two? So either the Raptor comes out exclusively as a Jeep, which is not that far-fetched, because by the time the Raptor came out, the Jeep brand was soaring, and I think under Ford, we soar the same way. Or we get our own version of the Raptor, and that would be freaking awesome. If we could call the Raptor ours, that would be amazing. I would love that so much. So that almost makes up for the fact that we probably get Vulcan V6s in our Cherokees, knowing that we probably get the Raptor. That is really enticing. Something I forgot to mention on the GM timeline, another vehicle, and I knew I was going to forget to mention it, another vehicle that we get is the Aztec. Think about it, right? A vehicle that's designed to be camped in. what were those things? All-wheel drive, right? Absolutely. Pontiac does not get the Aztek. This might actually lead to Pontiac dying earlier than 2009 because that kept them afloat for a little bit. Jeep gets the Aztek. Maybe they call it a Cherokee. Maybe they pull one of the old nameplates out of the bin there, but for sure. And that's another example of Chevy using us the way Toyota uses Prius. That really concludes the first part of this, all right? Ultimately, on the GM platform, everything gets merged in, we lose our identity, and then we lose our company, all right? On the Ford platform, Wrangler guys get to keep their identity. We get the possibility of some pretty fun models out there. The possibility of the Raptor, the possibility of a Gladiator, the possibility of like you know, more off-road version of the Explorer. I think 5-liter Jeeps sounds pretty awesome. I'm a big fan of the 5-liter. We do keep our company, and that's honestly, that's what's important. The Ford timeline is one of the brightest, with the exception of the Chrysler. Chrysler is the best case scenario. There's no doubt about it. No doubt about it. Even with the turmoil with Daimler Chrysler, even with the merger with FCA, Chrysler is the best timeline for Jeep. I'm going to cut it here so I don't make this video 4 hours long. There's going to be a part 2. And a teaser, there's 3 companies I'm going to talk about. One of them's Toyota. That's the teaser. So stop back to find out what the Jeep brand would look like if Toyota purchased us. It's a doozy. All right, if you have any questions, leave a comment down in the squawk boxes. Tell me what timeline you would prefer. Check back once I have the second part of this out. I'll link it up in the corner or down in there in the comments or something. All right, thanks for watching. See you next time.